What happens when the French amour propre is hurt? A furious France has recalled its ambassadors to the US and Australia and put off a French-British defense ministers meeting scheduled this week in response to a new security alliance between the US, UK and Australia. The pact, acronymed AUKUS, has Australia ditch its $65 billion submarine deal with France to opt instead for US technology to build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. And they're asking if China is laughing. What has resulted in a trust crisis among Western allies in the first place? Could this have been done differently? And how are other countries in the region regarding the controversial pact? Joining me from Beijing is Goeff Raby, former Australian ambassador to China, and from Paris, Professor Joav Toker from the American Graduate School of Diplomacy. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, Goeff, let me go to you first. Now, analysts have warned that the several actions taken by France, from putting off the defense minister's meeting with the UK to recalling its ambassadors to US and Australia, imply more than a diplomatic spat over a cancelled defense deal. It points to a trust crisis. Do you see it this way? I mean, how significant is this move diplomacy-wise?
Oh, good evening, Lucien. Extremely significant. Recalling an ambassador in diplomatic terms is really just one step below breaking diplomatic relations. It's actually one of the strongest measures you can possibly take to send to another country a very clear indication of your immense displeasure with their behaviour. I mean, the fact that the French have done it not only with Australia, recalling the French ambassador from Canberra, but also the French ambassador from Washington, really underscores that for Paris and for the President, who would have made the decision and given the instructions, this is a major problem, and certainly it goes to trust, it goes to many other matters in terms of the relations between France and Australia and France and the United States.
Right. The French foreign minister accused the AUKUS partners of engaging in lying, duplicity and a major breach of trust and contempt. Professor Toker, some say France is overreacting. What do you think of the French response? Besides the financial loss, what else was at stake for France?
France is reacting in a very powerful way. Indeed, rhetorically, in terms of the words and the terms that are there. But I'll nuance a little bit, if I may, what His Excellency the Ambassador said just for a minute ago. It's true that within diplomatic protocol and jargon, indeed calling one's ambassador back home is a strong step. But this is in the language of diplomacy. It is perhaps not as powerful as that when it comes to the mighty, very large dimensions of the issues we're dealing with. We're dealing perhaps with a new strategic, highly strategic plan, scheme, which is that which may characterize 10, 20, 30 years from now regarding the entire Pacific domain. This is huge. We're not sure these things actually indicate this new strategy all the way, but many signs are there to express that. And this is indeed the profound reason for French extreme rage of being kept away from the negotiations, actually being lied to by Australian and American and British counterparts, allies. So this is why we hear such harsh words. But you notice that President Macron did not say a word yet. His foreign minister and his defense ministers spoke harshly, but he himself hasn't spoken yet.
Okay, let's take a look at how Australia and the US presented the deal. Now, Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton, in a joint press conference with Australian and US officials on September the 16th, said the French have a version which was not superior to that operated by the US and UK, meaning the submarine, and the decision was taken keeping in mind the best interests of Australia's national security and security in the so-called Indo-Pacific. So, Goeff, this response has angered France even more. Did Australia foresee the consequences, like having its relationship with France tarnished? Or otherwise, why would it do something like this?
I think there's two key issues here that need to be separated, although they're closely linked. One is the AUKUS Security Pact, and I think that's a great concern to France that it was excluded over that. The other one is a submarine deal, and I think from the Australian government's point of view, they have simply not understood how significant a measure the AUKUS arrangement is and what a setback it is for France's ambitions to be a significant player in the Indo-Pacific region. I really think that very much for Canberra, the submarine deal, yes, it was huge. We will pay a big break fee, $400 million US dollars or more. But I think for ministers in Canberra, they saw it much more as a commercial arrangement and stepping away from a contract and really didn't consider, I think, the implications for France. I mean, they were thinking all the time about the implications for the Indo-Pacific and China, but not how France's role would be affected by this decision.
Yeah. Well, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that the U.S. looks forward to continuing working with NATO and the European Union, and France is a vital partner in this. But many headlines dismiss this as an indifferent reaction. Professor Toker, how do you interpret the U.S. comments? Steal the deal and then say, I understand you're angry? How could the US, being an ally of France, do something like this?
Well, on the surface, at the outset, you're right, but this is exactly what American leaders are trying to run after right now. So we have Secretary Blinken's trying to appease things. We know right now that there was a formal request of President Biden to talk on the phone with President Macron, and the Élysée Palace, the French presidency, confirmed that indeed this phone conversation will take place sometime over the coming 3 to 4 days. We also know that Secretary Blinken and French Foreign Minister are going to see each other in about 24 hours inside the UN General Assembly in New York. So one shouldn't lose the overall profound vision of all that. It's a crisis amongst allies, amongst strong allies. Sure. And it's a very serious crisis, perhaps the most significant one for a long period. But we still don't know what are the far-reaching, profound implications of this crisis on the surface regarding deep, long-term strategic issues.
Jeff, now the decision seems to have been made in a small circle, as you said, alluded to just now as well. This decision was made and probably not even aware by all ministers in the countries involved. Why such secrecy, and what about the prudence that's needed for making such an important policy or decision, and what about public opinion?
Yeah, a very, very good question, and I don't think the opposition in Australia is asking this question sufficiently strongly enough. Look, of course there has to be a great deal of confidentiality when making these sorts of decisions and planning, but this is for Australia a profound change in strategic posture and strategic outlook. We have now committed ourselves entirely to the United States as our guarantor. And this is something that really should have been discussed in the Parliament. There should be more public debate. I think that's really the big issue. I mean, not being inclusive with France itself is a big problem. I recognise that. But I do think that the way this whole thing was put together without any public discussion really points to a serious democratic deficit in Australia.
And it seems that there was not enough how should I say, they didn't calculate or foresee the kind of reactions they're going to get, because I was reading an opinion piece by a very famous American scholar, and he was saying, look, this move is going to be welcomed by countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Quite the contrary, you have the Indonesian senior leader, you have the Malaysian side coming out saying they're concerned or even deeply concerned about what's going to happen. Japan, of course, welcomed it. Singapore is being very cautious. The DPRK strongly condemns it. Iran of course, calls it an irony of historic proportions, and of course China is also very upset. So Jeff, I just don't understand. I mean, when policymakers are making these kind of policies, don't they go and think about what possible consequences they're going to trigger, and whether it's okay that they're going to have these mixed reactions from their neighbours, their immediate neighbours? Jeff?
Well, I think the policymakers have not really grasped the historic significance of this arrangement and what it means for changing strategic balance in the region. I think that's the first thing. Second point I'd make on this, though, is that a long time ago, as I set out in my book, Canberra formed the view that China was a strategic competitor and that we would glue ourselves to the hip of the United States to resist and contain China even, and this is the result of that. And so the primary policy consideration was what would work with the United States and repositioning us. And of course then Britain's involved. As we know, the British government is desperately looking for a role for Britain post-Brexit in the so-called global Britain world. And I mean, it begs the question, if Britain wants the role, why wasn't Britain brought into the Quad and make it a quint? This is very much about aligning ourselves with the United States and the United States' efforts to contain China.
Well, they have so many, acronyms that we are almost losing track of it. But Professor Toker, coming to you and thinking about the European impressions of the kind of reliability of the American strategic, posture or standing. Even the German ambassador to the UK, Andreas Michaelis, said over the weekend that the coherence and unity of the West will require lots of effort. What kind of mark, if any, do you think this deal will have, or this episode will leave on European minds about US's reliability, especially when you just see the Afghanistan withdrawal debacle?
Yeah, we will be hearing about this for months and years to come. I think that if we can try and anticipate a little bit on the implications of what has happened around the Pacific through European eyes, French and European eyes and British eyes as well, what has happened last week was announced publicly last week and triggered this crisis between the French and the Americans and the Australians will in a way add all the protagonists, let them be in Asia or in Europe or in the Americas, to better interconnect what is happening over the Pacific theaters rather, and the European one. This is something which is not very much on the immediate conscience of major European protagonists, especially those who are smaller, who don't have maritime forces. France has one, Britain has one, but that's not the case of most other European partners. And they have been used for decades, if not centuries, to think, how should I say, through Atlantic terms and through the transatlantic major element, which is the friendship and the alliance with the United States. Here comes the Pacific theater, about which we hear so much, and it has, through this immediate crisis, direct implications regarding positions of diplomacies and defense policies of Germany and Denmark and Italy and Spain on top of France and Britain.
Okay.
This, perhaps, we don't know which way it will develop, but we know that this interconnectivity may be clearer and more apparent.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Sorry to interrupt you, but many thanks to Goeff Raby, former Australian ambassador to China, and Professor Joav Toker from the American Graduate School of Diplomacy. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.